she gave water to a wounded Navajo. The next day, 50 warriors surrounded her ranch. The earth stretched endless and barren, split like shattered clay beneath a merciless sky. Wind drifted through withered sage, carrying the taste of sand, forgotten, dreams, and something nameless that lingered in the air like a prayer. Sarah Bennett pulled her worn bonnet lower and brushed the grit from her cheek. She had risen before first light, battling a collapsed gate and hoping the remaining spring water might last another day. Little remained, not of the water, not of her savings, and not of her strength, but the homestead was her only anchor now. Her husband had perished the winter before, claimed by a sickness that baffled every physician and offered no comfort to any minister. The settlement of Bitter Creek had laid him to rest hastily and moved on even faster. They regarded Sarah with the same weary glances reserved for women who defied convention. Too young for widowhood, too independent for remarriage. She dwelt beyond the cottonwood grove, where only the desperate or the determined made their homes. Most mornings, Sarah couldn't decide which she was. The breeze shifted. A vulture traced lazy circles overhead. That's when she spotted him. Initially, she mistook the figure for abandoned supplies left by passing travelers. But as she drew closer to the rocky outcrop behind her stable, her pulse quickened. A man lay motionless, breathing shallow. Crimson stained the ground around him, dark and dried like old paint. His long ebony hair was matted with dust. He wore no footwear, only a buckskin vest torn at the chest, exposing a gash deep enough to reveal sinew. Then she noticed the ornament, turquoise stones and an eagle's feather. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every tale from her childhood rushed back. Stories of raids, of burning homesteads, of families vanishing in the night. Warnings murmured in church aisles, curses muttered in saloons. She retreated a step, then another. But then he stirred. Not an attack, not a threat. Just a low, anguished sound as he attempted and failed to raise his head. He was dying slowly. Sarah glanced around. No one in sight. The road lay empty. The town wouldn't send aid. They wouldn't care if a wounded Navajo bled into the dust. She should have turned away. Logic demanded it. Instead, she walked back to the stable. Minutes later, she returned with a battered metal cup filled with precious spring water, nearly depleted, and knelt beside the man who might end her life if he survived. She spoke no words, asked no name. She simply cradled his head gently and brought the cup to his lips. At first, he refused. His eyes opened, dark, unreadable, fierce, and locked onto hers. Still, she waited. Then gradually, his lips parted. He drank. Only a sip, but it was enough. When he finished, she set the cup aside and rose, trembling. For a moment, she expected him to seize her wrist or speak or curse her in an unknown tongue. Instead, he gazed at her for several heartbeats, then closed his eyes and exhaled, almost peacefully. Sarah turned and walked back to the house, uncertain whether she had just preserved a life or invited death onto her land. That night she lay, sleepless, and before dawn could break over the mesa, thunder rolled across the hardpan. Not from the heavens, but from the earth itself. Dozens of hooves, dozens of riders, all approaching her homestead. The sun had barely crested the ridgeline when Sarah heard them. The ground trembled before she saw them. Countless horsemen silhouetted against the amber sky, their forms rising, like spirits from the horizon. Horses moved in perfect formation, soundless but swift. No dust plume, no war cries, just the rhythmic pounding of hooves approaching her ranch like a heartbeat growing stronger. She froze on the porch, gripping the old Winchester her husband had left behind. It held no ammunition. She'd never learned to fire it, but it offered some comfort against vulnerability. The first rider appeared beyond the corral, then another and another. Within moments, the homestead was encircled, warriors on all sides, their faces painted with quiet fury, feathers streaming in the wind. No one shouted, no one aimed a weapon, but their presence spoke volumes. Then she saw him, the wounded man. He rode at the front, sitting upright despite his pallor, blood still fresh on his shirt. He dismounted carefully, his gaze never leaving hers. The others waited, Sarah swallowed hard, not daring to speak. He approached slowly, favoring one leg, carrying himself with strange dignity even as his body betrayed his pain. When he stopped just yards away, the morning breeze caught his hair and revealed his face more clearly. Perhaps 30 years old, but weathered by hardship. A scar crossed his cheekbone. His eyes, sharp and obsidian, held no anger, only something deeper, something ancient. He raised one arm and spoke a single word in his language. The other riders remained motionless. Then he turned to them and added something she couldn't comprehend. Whatever he said transformed everything. Weapons lowered, expressions softened. Several men nodded, and just like that, the warriors began to withdraw. Some with backward glances, others without acknowledgement. All except one. He remained, the wounded man. He walked past her toward the stable and without permission settled in the shade beside the water trough. He didn't look at her again, just closed his eyes and leaned against the post as if he had always belonged there. Sarah stood there for what seemed like hours. The town would never believe it. They'd call her cursed or worse, traitorous. She could already hear the whispers. That widow's lost her mind, harboring a savage. They'll cut her throat and burn everything down. But no one had harmed her, and nothing had burned. She approached him, still clutching the empty rifle. "You shouldn't remain here," she said softly. "They'll come searching. The marshal, the townspeople." He opened his eyes, said nothing. "I gave you water," she added. "Not sanctuary, not this." Still no response, only a faint glimmer in his gaze, like amusement or defiance. "Do you understand me?" she asked. His voice, when it came, was low, rough, accented. "You saved. I guard." Sarah blinked. "You guard?" He nodded once. "Until you're safe." It was so matter-of-fact, so final. She stared at him, heart pounding. Then she sighed and muttered, "You're as stubborn as every man I've known." He almost smiled. Almost. By midday, the homestead was quiet again. The warriors had vanished, leaving only hoofprints and dust behind. The man, whose name remained unknown, stayed near the stable, speaking little, watching the horizon like a sentinel awaiting orders. He didn't request food, didn't ask for anything. But he repaired the gate she had failed to fix, split wood for the fire, and drew water from the spring. His wound continued seeping through the bandage she'd applied the previous night. Each time she tried to stop him working, he said the same thing. "You gave, I return." By evening, Sarah found herself setting 2 plates on the porch table, one for herself, one for him. He nodded when she did, but still, he didn't eat until she had taken the first bite. That night, when she extinguished the lamp, she looked through the window and saw him sitting beneath the stars, keeping watch, not as a guest, not as a prisoner, but as a guardian of something she couldn't yet name, something that felt secure. 2 nights passed, and during that time, no one came from Bitter Creek. No one inquired about the warriors. No one checked on the widow who'd lived alone too long. The silence felt more ominous than noise, but Sarah sensed it in her bones. Something was shifting. Each morning the Navajo man, who still hadn't shared his name, rose before dawn. He tended the fire, groomed the horses, and limped less now, though the bandage on his chest remained tight. She had offered to change it, but he had declined. No, the wound must stay. "Why?" He touched the stones around his neck. "So they remember. Pain teaches." It was the longest sentence he had spoken yet. By now, Sarah had stopped asking him to leave. Something about his presence felt not just secure, but essential, like the homestead breathed easier with him near. He never entered the house, never questioned why she lived alone, and never touched her. But she began to notice small things. A jackrabbit cleaned and left by her door, a broken latch in the stable quietly mended, her boots polished. Things no one had done for her since before Marcus died. On the 3rd morning, she rode to town, for flour and coffee. The moment she entered the general store, the room fell silent. 3 men stood nearby, cattle ranchers, hardened and bitter. Their eyes found her immediately. "Back from your war camp, Sarah," one of them sneered. She ignored the comment and reached for her sack of flour. Another man muttered, "They say you're keeping one of them out there on your land, feeding him, bedding him." The words cut deep, but she didn't flinch until the marshal stepped from behind the counter. Marshal Hawkins wasn't a cruel man, but he wasn't brave either. He cleaned his spectacles. "Mrs. Bennett, we've had reports." "Reports?" she repeated flatly. "Or gossip?" His jaw tightened. "You know tensions are high. Folks don't take kindly to harboring enemies." "He's not an enemy. He was wounded. I gave—" One of the ranchers laughed. "That's what you call it now?" Hawkins raised a hand. "Enough. Sarah, just be careful. People are nervous." She left without the coffee. That night, she sat on the porch, arms crossed tight, staring into the dusk. The Navajo warrior sat on the ground nearby, sharpening a small blade with a stone. He didn't look up, but she felt his attention shift. "They think I'm a traitor," she said. He stopped sharpening. "They think I'm sleeping with you." Silence. She looked at him. "You're not going to say anything?" He tilted his head, considering. "Words are smoke." She almost laughed. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one they'll drive out of town." He paused. "You gave water to a dying man. That is not shame. That is honor." He nodded once. "In my people, a woman who gives water gives life, not just to the body, but to the spirit. You gave what cannot be repaid." A long silence fell between them. Then, faintly, she whispered, "You speak like someone who's lost more than blood." His eyes darkened, and he returned to the blade. She didn't press. That night, after the lamp was out, Sarah awoke to sounds, wood splintering, voices outside, a cry cut short. She leaped from bed and ran to the window. 5 men with torches and guns had come while the world slept. They had come for her. One of them kicked the stable door open. Another shouted, "You in there, Indian lover? Come out!" She grabbed the rifle, useless still, but held it anyway. The front door burst open, and then a shadow moved faster than humanly possible. A blur of bone and steel. A scream. Another. A man fell, then another. In less than a minute, the yard was silent again. Sarah stood frozen in the doorway, breath catching in her throat. The Navajo man stood near the fence, breathing hard, the knife wet in his hand. 4 men lay groaning on the ground. The 5th had fled into the darkness. He turned to her. "I stay," he said simply, "until all danger sleeps." And she, shaken, heart racing, eyes wide, nodded once because for the first time since Marcus died, she didn't want to be alone anymore. By morning, the broken men were gone. Sarah hadn't asked where he took them. She hadn't asked how none of them died despite the blood. But she had seen the way he moved, like a windstorm wrapped in silence, and she suspected death had come close enough to be felt, then spared at the last second. Mercy, perhaps, or a message. Either way, word spread quickly. By midday, the town buzzed with whispers. Marshal Hawkins came riding up with 2 deputies, stopping just short of her fence line. Sarah met him on the porch with a calm she didn't feel, her hands still shaking beneath her shawl. "We heard there was an attack," Hawkins said, removing his hat. "You all right?" "I'm alive," she said plainly. He eyed the stable. "Was it true? Were they after him?" She didn't answer. "Sarah, I can't protect you if you don't—" "I never asked you to protect me," she snapped. A pause. The wind picked up, stirring the dirt at their feet. One of the deputies spat. "She's hiding a savage. That's what this is." The men were trying to run him off, protect the town. Sarah took a step forward. "They broke into my home in the middle of the night. You call that protection?" Hawkins raised a hand to calm the tension, but it was too late. The deputy's glare hardened. "You're putting us all at risk," he muttered. "The Navajo will turn on you quick." Then from behind the stable a shadow moved. He was there, the warrior, no weapon in hand, no threat, just his silent presence. But it was enough to send the deputies reaching for their holsters. Hawkins barked, "Stand down!" The air thickened, time froze. Then slowly, the Navajo man raised both hands and stepped back, disappearing into the shadows again. Hawkins looked at Sarah. "You've got to choose, Sarah. The town or him. You can't have both." She didn't flinch. I never asked for either. The marshal left with a heavy heart, but the deputy rode away with fire in his eyes. That evening, Sarah sat by the fire, arms wrapped tight around herself. You shouldn't have appeared, she told him. You're just giving them more reasons. He stirred the fire with a stick. They do not need reasons, only excuses. She stared at the flames. I used to believe this land was home. Now I'm not sure it was ever mine. He looked at her, his face softened by firelight. Home is not a place. It is a choice. And what if I chose wrong? She whispered. He was quiet for a long time, then finally said, Then we fight for it. The next day, the church doors slammed shut when she walked in. Mothers pulled their children close. A preacher turned his back. Outside, the saloon men fell silent when she passed. One muttered, Witch. Another threw a stone. It struck her shoulder hard enough to bruise. She didn't cry. She didn't stop. That night, she returned home and found a handmade object resting. On her porch, a small woven charm of grass and feathers, protective medicine. She looked out into the darkness and knew he was near. Watching, not because he owed her, but because something had shifted between them. A thread invisible but strong had been tied that day by the spring. With every threat from the town, it only pulled tighter. The wind howled that night like it had something to say. The shutters rattled, the lamp flickered low. Sarah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The echo of that stone hitting her shoulder still throbbing beneath her skin. They would come again. She could feel it in the bones of the house. Outside, the stable stood quiet, cloaked in darkness. The warrior hadn't spoken much since the marshal's visit. He worked, he watched, but the fire behind his eyes had cooled into something colder. He was waiting for something. So was she. At midnight, she heard it. Boots on boards, voices, whispers low and mean. She sat up. The door to the chicken coop slammed open. Then came the screams. Feathers flew, a torch was thrown. Flames licked the dry straw like a starving beast. Sarah grabbed the rifle, though she still didn't know how to fire it, and ran barefoot through the doorway. She saw them. 4 men, masked, drunk on power. One held a branding iron red with heat. Another held rope. And the third, Garrett. Of course it was Garrett. He was the man who owned half the town and wanted the other half. Ever since her husband died, he'd been circling her homestead like a vulture, offering help that always came with strings. I warned you, Sarah, he called out. You keep harboring savages, you'll lose more than chickens. Before she could reply, the stable doors burst open. Not running, just walking, deliberate, calm, a predator already in motion. Garrett raised his gun, but the warrior moved first. A blur, a crunch of bone. The man with the branding iron screamed, as the weapon was twisted from his hand and hurled into the dirt. One of the masked men ran. Another tried to fight, but he didn't make it far. The last man, Garrett, stood his ground, fury burning in his eyes. You think you can scare me? The warrior didn't answer. He stepped forward, blood dripping from his knuckles, and said just one word. Enough. Garrett sneered. You're lucky she's here. Otherwise, I'd gut you right here. That's when Sarah stepped beside the warrior and leveled the rifle, shaking but aiming straight. Try it, she said. See what happens. Garrett's sneer faltered. You wouldn't shoot me. She didn't blink. I don't have to. He already spared you once. The warrior said nothing, but his silence was thunder. Garrett spat into the dirt and turned. This isn't over. You're right, Sarah replied. It's just beginning. They doused the fire, saved what animals they could. By dawn, the yard smelled of ash and burnt feathers. The warrior's hands were torn. Sarah wrapped them in cloth, sitting on the porch beside him as the sky turned orange again. She didn't speak, neither did he, but there was something between them now. Thicker than smoke, stronger than silence, blood on the fence, truth in the soil, and a bond that neither war nor whispers could undo. The days grew hotter. Bitter Creek fell silent in her direction. No more stones, no more marshal. Only silence. And in many ways, that was worse. A town can yell in fear, but when it goes quiet, it starts to plan. Sarah tried not to let it consume her. She kept her head down, tended her land, fed the surviving chickens, repaired the coop with hands that had long since learned not to tremble. But her world had changed, and not just because of fear. The warrior stayed. He didn't speak much. He didn't ask to stay. He simply acted as if the land belonged to both of them now. And strangely, that assumption no longer frightened her. He repaired the stable roof, sharpened her tools, set snares that caught rabbits without harming them. They didn't talk over meals. He always waited for her to start eating first. He never sat too close, never lingered inside the house. Always just close enough to be felt, never close enough to be questioned. And it was in that space between what he said and what he didn't that something else began to take root. One night after supper, she found him outside, sitting cross-legged by the fire, carving something small from wood. The stars above them blinked like ancient eyes. She sat near him, quiet. "What are you making?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Memory." "For who?" He paused. "You." She blinked. "Why?" He kept carving. "You gave me water. Then you gave me choice." She tilted her head. "What choice?" "To stay." She looked into the flames. "No one else would have. Not in your place." He glanced at her, then back at his work. "You would." It wasn't a compliment. It was a truth. She smiled faintly. "I used to think kindness was weakness. Marcus, my husband, used to say it would get me killed." He didn't ask about Marcus. He didn't say sorry. He just waited, and so she continued. "He wasn't cruel, just distant, proper. He thought love was something you owed, not something you showed." The warrior turned the carving in his hand. It was beginning to take the shape of a bird, an eagle maybe, its wings spread wide. "And you?" he asked softly. She hesitated. "I used to think I had to earn love, that if I worked hard enough, smiled enough, stayed quiet enough, someone might think I was worthy of it." He looked at the carving. "You were always worthy." The words hit her like the first drop of rain after months of drought. She didn't respond, but her eyes burned. The next morning she found the carving on her windowsill. An eagle, carved smooth and strong, with a single turquoise bead tied around its neck. She ran her fingers over it slowly, then tucked it into her pocket, close to her heart. That day, she baked cornbread, real cornbread, with the last of the good flour, and brought it out to him near the fence line. They ate together under the sun, still no words. But they didn't need them anymore because what lived between them now didn't need language. It was built in silence, forged in fire, bound not by promises but by presence. The first time she touched his skin, it wasn't intentional. They were moving a heavy beam from the stable roof, and her hand slipped. His fingers caught her wrist, steadying her before she fell. Calloused, firm, but careful. She looked down at the place where his hand gripped hers, then up at the long scar that ran from the base of his thumb to the bend of his elbow. "How did you get that?" she asked quietly. He released her hand. A pause then. "I was 12. The soldiers came. She didn't move. They said we had stolen horses. We hadn't. But they burned our crops anyway, took my elder brother, set fire to our hogan." He looked past her at something far away. "My grandmother pushed me out the back, told me to run. I didn't want to, but I did." He ran a thumb over the scar. "A saber caught me as I escaped. I bled alone under a juniper tree for 4 days." Sarah swallowed. "What happened to her?" His voice was quieter now. "They killed her, left her body in the ashes." She reached for the beam again, but her hands trembled. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "You didn't do it." "Doesn't mean I'm not sorry." He looked at her then. "That is why I stay," she frowned. "Because I'm sorry?" "No," he said. "Because you remember what others choose to forget." That night, it rained. The first real rain in weeks. She stood on the porch and watched the sky open up, felt the cool drops on her face like a blessing. When she went inside, to check on a letter that had come that day from the county courthouse, her hands shook as she read it again. Marcus had signed a preliminary agreement to sell the homestead to Garrett. It wasn't finalized, but it existed. She heard footsteps and came through the stable doors, eyes alert. Sarah held up the letter with a trembling hand. He was going to sell this place to Garrett. The warrior took the page gently and read it once. His face didn't change, but something behind his eyes hardened. "You still have the land," he said. "For now," her voice cracked. "If Garrett kept a copy, he'll come with papers and a judge. And I—" Her voice broke again. "I thought Marcus loved this place. I thought he loved me." The warrior folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. "He loved control," he said. "Not land, not you." The words weren't cruel. They were freeing. That evening, Sarah rode into town alone. She didn't tell the warrior. She didn't ask permission. She wore her best dress, the one she hadn't touched since the funeral, and pinned her hair like the women she used to admire in Bitter Creek. Let them see her coming. Let them stare. At the courthouse, she asked to see Judge Morrison. The clerk hesitated. "You got business, Mrs. Bennett?" She held out the letter. He read it, eyes widened. "I see." 10 minutes later, the judge met her in his office, a large man with thick spectacles and a dislike for complications. She laid the letter on his desk. "This was never filed. My husband intended to sell the land, but he died before anything was signed. Now Garrett's trying to claim it, and he's doing it through intimidation." The judge studied her. "You have proof of intimidation?" "I have ashes on my porch and scars on my fence." A long pause. Then he said, "Let me look into it." Back at the homestead, the warrior was waiting. She handed him the letter. "It's not over," she said, "but I'm not going to run." He nodded once. "Good." Then, without warning, she stepped closer, placed her hand on his chest, felt the steadiness of his breath beneath her palm, and said, "I don't want to carry this alone anymore." His hand came up slowly, resting over hers, not pulling her closer, just holding. There was no kiss, no declaration, only two people broken by different worlds, sharing a truth too sacred for words. The next morning, she woke before dawn. The warrior was already saddling the horses. He didn't ask her if she was sure, and she didn't tell him she was scared. They both knew. The air was thick with heat, though the sun had barely risen. Somewhere in the distance, an eagle cried sharp and high. It felt like a warning. They rode side by side, past the broken gate, past the burned coop, past the place where blood had soaked the dirt. Sarah didn't look back. She'd done that too many times already. By the time they reached the town square, people were already gathered. Garrett stood at the center, arms crossed, smug as a fox in a henhouse. His men flanked him, rough and ready, and there by the courthouse steps stood Judge Morrison. Sarah dismounted and handed her reins to the warrior, then marched straight through the crowd, eyes locked on the judge. Garrett laughed. "Well, well, look who's found her nerve." She ignored him. "Judge, you said you'd look into the deed." Morrison nodded slowly. "I did." He held up a folder. "Mr. Garrett never filed a purchase contract. There's no legal transfer. And the letter you brought proves intent, not completion." Garrett stepped forward, face darkening. "We had a deal." "You had a promise," the judge said sharply. "From a man who's no longer alive." "That doesn't mean you own the land." The murmurs began at once. Garrett's voice rose. "She's lying. That paper could have been forged. She's shacked up with a Navajo, for God's sake. She'd do anything to keep that ranch." All eyes turned to the warrior. He stood still, calm, and yet everyone took one step back, except Garrett. He drew a pistol. It happened fast, too fast for thought, but not too fast for the warrior. He moved with the speed of lightning. One step, two, and then he was between Sarah and the gun. A shot rang out. Gasps, screams. The bullet missed, not by accident, because the warrior had knocked Garrett's arm sideways with the force of a sledgehammer, sending the pistol flying. Then, without a sound, he pinned Garrett to the ground, one knee on his chest, one hand around his throat. Still no word, still no hate, only pressure, enough to remind, not enough to kill. Morrison shouted, "Let him! Go!" The warrior looked to Sarah. She nodded. He stood. Garrett choked, gasping for breath. humiliated before the whole town, but no one stepped in to help him, not this time. Later, the judge handed her a signed paper. "Your deed," he said. "It's yours now, legally, permanently." Sarah took it with both hands. "Thank you," she whispered. He looked over her shoulder at the warrior. "You might consider moving farther out for safety." She nodded. "We'll consider a lot of things." That night, back at the homestead, they didn't speak of the town, or the gun, or the faces that had finally looked at them with something close to respect, or at least weariness. Instead, she brought out 2 cups of coffee. They sat under the stars, shoulders nearly touching. "I thought I would lose everything," she said. The warrior looked at her. "You found something instead." She turned toward him. He hesitated. Then, with more courage than she'd ever seen in his eyes, he said, "Someone." Weeks passed. The sky shifted from summer's fire to the golden breath of autumn. The land cooled. The cicadas fell quiet. The earth, once so parched, began to soften under cooler winds. And still he stayed. Not as a guest, not as a ghost, but as something in between. The warrior never asked for anything. He slept in the stable even when she offered the spare room. He ate only what she shared. He spoke little, but his presence became part of the homestead, like the hills or the windmill. Constant, grounding. One evening, as Sarah brought in the laundry, she caught sight of him by the spring. He was staring at it, not drinking, just staring. She approached, her skirts brushing the dry grass. "What is it?" He didn't look up. "This is where it began." She nodded. "I was ready to die here," he said, "and you gave me life." Her voice was soft. "I didn't do much." He turned to her. "You did everything." A long silence followed. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. She opened it slowly. A necklace. Beads of bone and silver threaded with a single hawk. Feather and a stone carved into the shape of a spiral. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "What does it mean?" He looked at her. "Water is more than survival to my people. It's spirit, memory, the bond between 2 lives." She traced the beads with her fingers. "And this stone? It means you are not alone." Her breath caught. "I made it for you," he said, "but only if you choose to wear it." She looked up into his eyes, dark, steady, unflinching. "I choose," she said. From that day on, things began to change, slowly, deliberately. The townsfolk still whispered, but some began to wave. An old woman brought eggs from her coop. A child left wildflowers on the fence. No apologies, no explanations. But kindness at last began to return. One afternoon, Marshal Hawkins stopped by on horseback. He removed his hat and said, "I'm not here on business, just checking in." She offered him coffee. He declined, then added, "The council voted. They're not going to press anything, not now." She nodded. "Thank you." He glanced toward the stable where the warrior was mending a wheelbarrow. "Is he ever going to leave?" Sarah looked over her shoulder. The warrior didn't notice them. He was focused, hands moving with quiet purpose. She smiled. "He already has a place." Hawkins gave a grunt that could have meant anything, then tipped his hat and rode off. That night, as stars blanketed the sky and the wind played softly through the dry grass, Sarah sat beside the fire with the warrior. She leaned her head gently against his shoulder. He didn't move away. She whispered, "Do you ever miss the life you had before?" He was quiet a long time, then said, "Yes, but this is something new." She nodded, and together they listened, to the wind, to the water in the spring shifting softly below, to the silence that now felt like home. Sometimes the most powerful acts are the smallest: a cup of water, a place to rest, a word left unspoken but deeply understood. Sarah's story reminds us that kindness carries risk, but it also carries reward, that love doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives in silence, stays through fire, and speaks with actions far louder than words.